Hi, everyone. This is Tim Valley, your host today for the webinar, Biden Administration, the First 100 Days and Key Developments to Watch. Thank you all for joining. Happy you're all here, and let's get started. Before I launch into the webinar, I just wanted to remind everyone that this webinar is not intended to be and is not legal advice, even though it is from a law firm. Also, given today's content, I wanted to remind everyone that this is not a political webinar. Rather, today we're just going to be discussing the Biden-Harris administration's actions and how that could impact government contractors. So again, not legal advice and not political, more factual and impact. I want to introduce myself first. My name is Tim Valley. I'm an associate here at PilieroMazza. I work in the GovCon group, particular emphasis on GAO and Court of Federal Claims protests, but I also do a lot of advising on regulatory compliance matters, particularly with small business programs, data rights, intellectual property, innovations. I do some work with the False Claims Act. So that's my background. It's also, I think, helpful when reviewing the news, which is primarily what we're going to be looking at today, and how the Biden administration has implemented its goals and priorities in the first 100 days and beyond. So that's me. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the firm, PilieroMazza. I've been with the firm for almost 5 years now. It's a business law firm, although it's known for its government contracts firm. It actually is a business law firm, but it covers many, many areas and represents clients in a number of areas, such as audits and investigations, business and transactions, labor and employment, intellectual property. So it's quite a broad array of topic areas that we cover here at PilieroMazza. So you're in good hands with us, whether it's government contracting or litigation. So today, like I said, we're covering the Biden administration and its first 100 days in office, and also covering key developments to watch, and also some of the, now that we're about 8 months out, some of the ramifications that have occurred from the first 100 days, particularly with the executive orders. First 100 days, you certainly saw, as you do with many new administrations, numerous executive orders get issued. The Biden administration also put forward its first major piece of legislation called the American Rescue Plan Act. It also proposed the American Jobs Plan. So the key focus of this administration is, of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic right now. But long term, it's also infrastructure, research and development, technology innovation, American manufacturing, small businesses, and of course, climate change. Taking all of these together, and as you'll see throughout this webinar, these actions strongly indicate that the Biden-Harris administration is going to continue to rely upon the private sector and government contractors. All of the signs lead to that. We are predicting growth in the government contracting sphere, which is, of course, great for government contractors. Of course, the administration is also focusing, as we'll discuss later on racial equality, and enforcement of labor law enforcement, including some new labor laws and regulations. Today, just to give you a quick overview, I plan to cover national security, social justice actions, climate change, infrastructure, supply chain, and workforce goals, and we'll end it off with key developments to watch, and then a short Q&A if we have time. But we have a lot to cover, so let's just dive right in and start off with national security. So there's no doubt that national security is in the news on a daily basis, and and this administration is all over it. Keeping with our first 100 days theme, on essentially day one, the administration took quick action on the border wall. They issued a proclamation regarding the southern border wall with Mexico, paused construction, mandated a review of contracts and contracting methods, and proposed next steps within 60 days. In other words, the administration wanted to know from its federal agencies, what's next steps. So what happened with the border wall? As recently as April 30th, all Department of Defense funds used in construction were canceled and diverted to more critical missions. On June 11th, there was a return of $2 billion of funding to the military and devoted the rest to construction site cleanup. Homeland Security canceled 2 contracts for walls spanning about 31 miles. They're continuing to review projects to determine which ones are necessary. DHS has also asked Congress to cancel the remaining border wall funding and instead fund border technology and modernization of land ports of entry. Some of this is, for example, radar technology, digital walls or IT walls that instead of having a physical wall, you use technology instead to track the border. Government contractors here can expect to see this money referenced above moved elsewhere and potentially refocused into other technology initiatives or other border projects. So moving from the border into the greater frontier, the next frontier in space, the administration has, in this case, supported a Trump-era program. With the wall, they got rid of it, but this one, they liked it. And they've greenlit the program for U.S. Space Force as of February 4th, and is providing its full support including through government contracting to help advance and provide a platform for space technology development. As of May, the White House proposed a budget of $24.8 billion to NASA, the largest in NASA history, with a 9% increase in the NASA Science Division and a 5% increase in deep space funding. As recently as August 11th, they're in the preliminary stages of creating a new group within Space Force to coordinate military space assets to use in the Middle East. So full support here for NASA and Space Force, and a lot of money getting put into this area. So should be plenty to do for government contractors with NASA. Continuing on April 9th, the White House submitted its DoD budget to Congress for fiscal year 2022. It proposed $715 billion with a particular emphasis on research, which, research and development. They also emphasized naval shipbuilding and investments in hypersonic capabilities and countering biological threats. So that being said, procurement, acquisition, it's predicted that it may stay flat or go down slightly for DoD funding. But you're certainly gonna see some growth in R&D, which really aligns with this administration's overarching goals. We're going to be talking about R&D quite a bit today, so be prepared for that. And even if procurement stays flat with DoD, I mean, $715 billion is no small number, and a big chunk of that is going to go to procurement. So plenty to go around, as they say in DoD. And if you're in R&D, you can definitely keep your eye out for some growth opportunities there. Of course, Congress is going to have to go through this budget. We don't know where this proposed $715 $715 billion will wind up, but we're interested to see it. And as of July, we saw in the House at least a procurement budget would drop 2% to $134.3 billion, but nothing's set in stone yet. Start the DoD budget. Of course, you can't maybe go a week without hearing about a new cyber threat in the news. This has been quite prevalent, particularly in the first 8 months of this administration. On May 12th, in response to a cyber attack, the Biden-Harris administration issued an executive order with 8 required actions listed on the slide. They include removing barriers to sharing threat information, modernizing cybersecurity by moving to cloud enterprises, requiring greater transparency from software developers, establishing a review team for Solar Wind, a massive cyber attack or cyber hack that occurred, standardizing government response to attacks, improving detection of vulnerabilities, improves abilities to store and retain data, and adopting standard processes for national security systems. We will see how that unfolds. In other news, as recently as July, the Department of Energy updated its cybersecurity capability maturity model, known in the field as C2M2, to provide some historical context. This was developed in 2012 by the Department of Energy in collaboration with Homeland Security and industry partners. It exists to help firms self-evaluate and make improvements to their own cybersecurity programs and strengthen operational resilience, particularly on information technology and operations technology. It's truly a collaborative effort in the government contracting sphere, both government side and GovCon side, at all levels, whether you're prime contractor or subcontractor. In the revised C2M2, that include specific updates to align with the NIST framework. They're aimed to improve clarity and ease of implementation, and a new cybersecurity architecture domain, and revisions to the risk management domain. I think it's fair to say that contractors can expect to see additional regulatory requirements, particularly from DoD, if you haven't seen them already, and continued growth in this area. It is certainly a hot area that the administration is heavily focused on, particularly given the recent cybersecurity threats that have arisen. So that's national security. We're going to move on to social justice actions here. It should be no surprise. This is another hot topic in the news these days. And this administration, through its efforts, has certainly shown an increased effort to tackle social issues, particularly concerning racial equality. And we have no doubt that this will remain a crucial part of the administration's focus. And it certainly implicates federal employment, but also government contractors. So we definitely wanted to highlight some of that today. So, to reiterate, this is a top priority for this administration. Day one, January 20th, President Biden issued an executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underdeserved communities. Day one, that should strongly signal this administration's focus and commitment to social justice issues. In that executive order, he ordered an agency review of potential barriers that underserved communities and individuals face in procurement and contracting opportunities within 200 days, and ordered OMB to assess agency policies and report back to the White House within 6 months. That's on day one. So next slide, please. Where are we today? The White House, following issuance of that executive order, They updated American Jobs Plan tailored to underserved communities and build Black wealth, echoing $10 billion to Community Revitalization Fund and $15 billion for grants and technical assistance to retrofit transportation infrastructure. So again, they've signaled increased contracting with small businesses, including disadvantaged businesses, hub zones, 8A firms, and minority and woman-owned businesses. The administration has also indicated that it may require additional subcontracting with these same small businesses. So all government contractors should expect measures along these lines during this administration and in the near future. I see a question came in. Contract opportunities for Native American-owned contractors, given that the first Native American is in charge of the Department of Interior, and a Native American has been nominated to head the National Park Service. Yeah, I agree. I think there's certainly no doubt that there'll also be increased government contracting for Native American-owned contractors. I don't have a slide on that today, but given time limits, but this is, I would imagine, certainly a priority for this administration. Additionally, the White House has pledged billions of dollars to small business programs, including $31 billion in small business programs under the American Jobs Plan, and growing federal contracting with small disadvantaged businesses, particularly, I'm emphasizing disadvantaged businesses, by 50%. This translates into an additional $100 billion over 5 years. If you pull up the action, this is the largest growth for disadvantaged businesses since they started collecting data in this area 30 years ago. So government contractors, particularly disadvantaged government contractors, should expect to see that money start flowing soon. On the labor side, the White House budget request calls for a larger or enlarged role for the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, the OFCCP. They've asked it to develop a comprehensive initiative to advance racial equity at work by helping to close racial pay gaps. To give you some scope, the OFCCP extends its affairs into 25,000 government contractors and 120,000 other businesses, which covers about 20% of the workforce. So that's a large amount of businesses. So, you know, what's the bottom line here is contractors are going to see enforcement of OFCCP regulations and should plan accordingly, whether that's beefing up affirmative action plans or making sure they have regulatory compliance policies and procedures in place. This administration is certainly focused on this issue, and government contractors should be prepared. As recently as June 25th, President Biden has issued an executive order on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the federal workplace. This relates back to President Biden's prior executive order on racial equity and other social justice issues, and again continues to show the administration's commitment in this area, particularly for federal hiring. He's asked to create a government-wide diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility initiative and strategic plan to cultivate the workforce that draws from the full diversity of the nation, and has asked agencies to conduct a review and assessment, like with the other executive orders. So we should be seeing a report, maybe by the end of the year, a little after, into the new year. Moving on from social justice to the next major topic, climate change. Again, another issue you can't help but see in the news. You know, as recently as Hurricane Henri, the flooding in Tennessee, the wildfires. This is definitely a hot topic area, and the administration has shown through its actions that it's certainly going to start tackling climate change. To reiterate again, first 100 days, President Biden issued an executive order called Tackling the Climate Crisis at Home and Abroad, and particularly focused on using federal procurements to achieve a carbon pollution-free electricity sector no later than 2035, and zero emission vehicle fleets for federal, state, local, and tribal governments. So again, first 100 days, first week even of this administration is focusing on climate change. So, at a minimum, government contractors can expect to see increased demand for production of electric vehicles, clean power, and particularly using American services and technologies. This administration is also really focusing heavily on loans and contracting activity to spur research and innovation in this area. It's something President Biden remarks on quite frequently, is using public sector funds to spur innovation and to have America become a leader in this area. And you can see that starting to translate through executive orders and in legislation. As one example, this administration has reactivated an Obama-era loan program in March 3rd, where the Secretary of Energy authorized more than $40 billion in federal loans and loan guarantees to clean energy startups and projects. So like I mentioned earlier, a lot of the funding is going to be loans and grants for research and development. It's a hot topic area. It's an area that this administration is really, really focused on as it concerns government contractors. The other area of climate change that the Biden administration is particularly focused on is offshore wind projects. So on May 11th, the White House approved its first major offshore wind project off of Martha's Vineyard, looking to get generating 30 gigawatts of energy from offshore wind by 2030. It also creates they anticipate it'll create 3,600 jobs and provide enough power for 400,000 homes and businesses. Another example of offshore wind farm as recent as May 25th. They're looking to open up the north and central coast of California for a first commercial wind energy farm on the Pacific coast. A whopping 380 windmills across 400 square miles of Morro Bay. Here's another example of proposing a competitive lease sale for offshore wind development in New York and New Jersey. Proposed lease areas to have the potential to unlock over 7 gigawatts of offshore wind energy, which would power 2.6 million homes. The main point of all these examples is that these are going to be jobs that involve the federal government and government contractors. So it's not just electric vehicles, it's offshore wind and clean energy. And you're going to start seeing a larger emphasis on these types of large projects. This also translates, as you can see in the numbers, again, this administration is heavily focused on R&D and clean energy. We predict that this will translate quite well for government contractors who are in these fields. And as I flagged above, this is a bipartisan passage through the Senate of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs and bill, and it's now proceeding to the House in August. The Senate bill invested $105 billion for sustainable transportation options, including rail and bus, $7.5 billion in national network for plug-in electrical vehicle chargers. Again, tying that back to the executive order, he's putting his money where his mouth is, and investing $60 billion in power infrastructure, including transmission lines and R&D for smart grid technologies. So this is where you're seeing in his first 100 days the executive orders being issued and then translating through legislation, which has gotten traction in the Senate and is now before the House. The Biden administration also issued on August 5th, very recently, an executive order on strengthening American leadership in clean cars and trucks. It sets the goal that 50% of all new passenger cars and light trucks sold in 2030 will be zero-emission vehicles. And the Biden administration has directed the administrator of the EPA to consider work on rulemaking regarding emission standards for all sizes of vehicles. So for contractors, this of course means more regulations, new regulations, revised regulations, but also a growing industry. It's, here's where the winds are shifting, at least under this administration, and you can expect to see growth there. So to wrap it all up, the Biden administration for climate change it's serious on this. It's a hot issue. It's issuing executive orders as recently as August, and it's moving through Congress to get funding to move in this area. The next major topic that I wanted to dive into was infrastructure, supply chain, and workforce goals. I'm sure you've all heard references to the supply chain throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, infrastructure issues, and workforce goals. And so now I'd like to just go through some of the actions that this administration has taken in response to some of those issues. So, keeping with our theme of 100 days, President Biden on January 21st, basically second day in office, issued an executive order on the sustainable public health supply chain. In this, agencies were instructed to invoke the Defense Production Act as necessary to support long-term capability of manufacturing supplies for future biological threat preparedness. The Trump administration also used the Defense Production Act. The Biden administration also used the DPA. So you all know, if you don't know, DPA concerns rated orders that require, priority under the law, meaning they're going to take precedence over other orders that the government issues to government contractors. The EO also covered that agency heads and COVID-19 response coordinators shall start acquiring additional stockpiles, improve distribution systems, build market capacity, or expand the industrial base. Of course, a lot of this was brought on by the pandemic, which of course remains ongoing, and we can expect to see additional DPA rated orders for the coming months. Another key area for this administration, while of course limited by trade agreements that we have with other countries, has definitely been the Buy American mandate, which is something all government contractors have to keep in mind when contracting with the government. On January 25th, again, within the first week, the administration issued an EO or executive order called Ensuring the Future is Made in All of America by All of America's Workers. This is clearly a return to American manufacturing, and the administration has kept with this promise, as I'll explain shortly. The first thing, and this is pretty common under a new administration, like I mentioned, the administration revoked President Trump's Buy American executive orders, fairly common for a new administration, particularly if it's a new party, to come in and do that, and then issue its own executive orders. Under the Biden-Harris administration, they instructed agencies to maximize the use of goods produced and services offered in the U.S. And increase transparency for domestic manufacturing contracts. They also provided that agencies shall also scout potential small and medium-sized American firms capable of meeting U.S. procurement needs. So again, if for small or medium-sized firms, this is an indication that there could be a growth opportunity in the near future. Interestingly, President Biden also directed the FAR Council to consider amending FAR to replace the component test of the Buy American Act with a value-added test, to increase the numerical threshold for domestic content requirements for end products and construction materials, and to increase price preferences for domestic end products and domestic construction materials. So continuing on, President Biden also asked the OMB to establish a Made in America office with a Made in America director. It also provides that before granting a waiver of the Buy American Act, the agency is required to provide, or I'm sorry, the contractor is required to provide detailed justification to the Made in America director. It also directs agencies to identify suppliers of American-made products. It also directed agencies within 180 days to detail their implementation and compliance with Made in America laws, describe any waivers, and provide any recommendations to further the executive orders policy. So as you can see, President Biden, as with his other executive orders, they're not just broad policy statements, they're expecting to see actions in fairly quick turnarounds. I would say pretty quick by government standards, given that it's 180 days, which is a short amount of time for a large bureaucratic agency like the United States, or I'm sorry, organization like the United States to move. 180 days might seem long in the private sector, but for the government sector, it's a very quick amount of time to move on some of these things. So as you'll see in the next slide, the agencies moved accordingly. DoD, GSA, and NASA, who make up the FAR Council, by July 30th, issued a proposed rule to amend the federal acquisition regulations to address the Buy American executive order. So in the proposed rule, which is subject to, of course, to notice and comment by the public, they noted that they're going to increase the domestic content threshold. They provide a schedule for future increases and create a fallback threshold, allowing for products meeting a specific lower domestic content threshold to qualify as domestic products. They established an enhanced price preference for critical domestic products or made up of critical components, and created a post-award domestic content reporting requirement for contractors. So these are some of the things that government contractors could expect to see implemented in the FAR in the near future. Continuing on with the proposed rule, as recently as July 30th, the FAR Council, again, DoD, GSA, and NASA, are seeking information from the public regarding the strengths and weaknesses of the component test, since President Biden expressly recommended review of it. But they did note that they're, at this time, not replacing the component test or the value-added test. But in 2 days' time at 9 a.m., there'll be a public meeting, and then public comments to the rule are due on September 28th. So if you're at all interested in commenting on those rules, that would be the deadline as of right now. And I saw a question, how do we get info on the public meeting? I would check the Federal Register or just do some Googling. It should be pretty quick to find. on regulations.gov. Turning back to another executive order issued within the first 100 days is the America's Supply Chain. So it mandated a 100-day review addressing supply chain vulnerabilities in 4 areas, and those areas are active pharmaceutical ingredients, critical minerals, semiconductors, and large capacity batteries, and also for a review of federal incentives and any amendments to federal procurement regulations that are necessary to attract and retain investments in critical goods and materials. This really goes back to one of the themes that has run throughout today's webinar, which is R&D funding and technological innovation. This is certainly an area where the government wants to see innovation and a strong interplay with, American infrastructure and small businesses in line with the Buy American policies. And as with all the other executive orders to date, the administration sought results fairly quickly. In this case, a 100-day supply chain report was released, and it had 4 major recommendations. The report itself is 250 pages long, but the 4 key recommendations or major recommendations are rebuilding domestic production and innovation capabilities, again, leveraging Buy American requirements and government investments, creating a new trade strike force to strengthen international trade rules, and of course, monitoring near-term supply chain disruptions as the economy reopens from the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think government contractors can expect to see growth in these 4 areas moving forward. Another major workforce issue was the executive order, which increased the hourly minimum wage for federal contractors. They did this on April 27th. They increased the minimum wage for federal contractors to $15 per hour with adjustments based on inflation, and they ordered that it's going to be implemented through a FAR clause. And this increase must be included in new contracts and modifications by January 30th, 2022, which is a short while away. But government contractors can likely expect to see a new FAR clause issued to implement this executive order. I think contractors should also expect more enforcement in current labor laws and probably some additional labor protections through federal contracting regulations, particularly executive orders, to the extent that they're not provided through legislation by Congress and signed into law. An additional action taken, executive order on promoting competition in the American economy. They've called for over 72 initiatives promoting competition by regulating big business. One goal is to increase opportunities for small businesses by directing all federal agencies to promote greater competition through the procurement and spending decisions. Again, a key focus on small businesses and growing opportunities for small businesses. The tech industry has asked the FTC to establish rules barring unfair methods of competition on internet marketplace. And finally, for banking, they've asked DOJ and the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency to update guidelines on banking mergers to more heavily scrutinize mergers. On June 11th, we also saw enforcement of procurement-related fraud. OMB sent guidance to reduce waivers and increase transparency for the Buy American Act. It also had issued guidance on waivers that will apply to more than 100 federal agencies, and it's going to be phased in over the next several months. And the administration is also going to maintain a database to increase transparency of all proposed waivers sought by agencies to bypass purchasing materials not available domestically. So this goes again to Buy American policies and procedures that are being put in place, and the administration's enforcement efforts. Of course, the administration's three-part plan of Build Back Better agenda, which was released in agenda. It's three parts: the American Rescue Plan, the American Jobs Plan, and the American Families Plan. The American Rescue Plan is the only part that's been passed officially, but parts of the American Jobs Plan are in play, they're currently in Congress, and including the pending Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. The American Rescue Plan laid the foundation for the American Jobs Plan, which will of course rely upon government contractors and grants pretty heavily. So government contractors can certainly expect to see growth in these areas based on this legislation. For example, the American Rescue Plan Act, the first major legislation that the Biden administration passed back on March 11th, within the first 100 days, saw a $1.9 trillion federal funding get passed through Congress and signed into law. Of that, $10 billion was for critical infrastructure projects to help states, territories, and tribal governments carry out critical capital projects. Harkening back to earlier in the webinar, $10 billion for Defense Production Act purchases to expand domestic manufacturing of the vaccines, test kits, PPE, and other medical supplies. Government contractors can expect to see this money doled out for probably years as the pandemic goes on, and they should certainly expect to see enforcement to follow relief efforts. On March 31st, the Biden administration also introduced the proposed American Jobs Plan. It's, knock on wood, but it appears that the plan will pass in some form. Of course, not exactly as proposed to Congress, but and to the public, but it should make its way through a bipartisan Senate and then through the House and be signed into law at some point. Bottom line, though, is that it's going to spur additional government contracting opportunities, and in line with this administration, will include enforcement mechanisms. And like I've been saying throughout, it's going to have focus particularly on research and development innovation to fight back against issues like climate change, threats from abroad, and even future pandemics. And you can see that in the numbers above, as we were discussing, and particularly for this section with infrastructure. The administration proposed investing about 1% of U.S. gross domestic product per year over 8 years, which is $2 trillion in infrastructure R&D, manufacturing and related activities, which are all areas that are going to rely heavily upon government contractors. I also just wanted to highlight a few more numbers out of this proposed legislation, including $621 billion in transportation infrastructure, $115 billion for bridges, highways, and roads, $174 billion for electric vehicle market, and $300 billion for clean drinking water infrastructure. Again, $180 billion in R&D to compete with China, $300 billion for American manufacturing and small businesses, and $100 billion for broad access to high-speed internet. Of the plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Job Act did pass the Senate, as I mentioned. It proceeded to the House on August 10th. There's now $550 billion in new spending. So, similar to the American Jobs Plan. Some of the major goals are to improve sustainable transportation, repair and rebuild roads and bridges, particularly to emphasize on climate change, creation of the electric vehicle chargers, high-speed internet, and upgrades to power infrastructure. So again, in this legislation, these executive orders that have been issued are truly reflected, and the administration is truly driving this home. Another particular to small businesses, on August 19th, they highlighted that there would be tax benefits. So 97% of small businesses will be protected from tax increases, and will give tax cuts to 3.9 million small businesses. It also introduced, critically, paid leave, which would be a nationally funded paid leave program, guaranteeing 12 weeks of paid parental, family, and personal leave by year 10 of the program. It'll also help ensure workers get 3 days of bereavement leave. And importantly for small businesses, the wage replacement would come from the federal government. So this is a fairly large shift in paid leave for paternal leave from the government side. Continuing on, additional contracting opportunities. The government contractors should expect to see increased federal contracting opportunities for small businesses. They're also seeking to create a national network of incubators and business development centers. It also called on Congress to invest in federal programs that will empower small firms to continue federal research and development initiatives. Creates a new grant program through Minority Business Development Agency, helping small undeserved manufacturers, and also seeks to inject billions of dollars into SBA's 7A loan program. So as you can see, huge benefits proposed for small businesses. And I just want to finish off today with some key developments to watch. Of course, everything I've mentioned previously, but next slide, please. But some key developments that I thought that were worth mentioning were agencies are currently assessing racial inequities and creating reports to implement new policies to better serve historically disadvantaged communities. And you're going to start seeing enforcement in that area and growth opportunities for government contractors, potential passage of the Equality Act, passage of the Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act. I mentioned earlier 72 initiatives encouraged by the executive order on promoting competition in the American economy, a final rule on the Buy American policies, and of course, the Biden administration's overarching plan of Build Back Better and implementation of that agenda. That is all I have today. To the extent there are any questions, I answered the 2 that came in. But if there are any questions, I'll leave a minute for anyone to send those into the chat box. Otherwise, when we get them, I will try to respond if I can after the webinar. Thank you all for joining me today. We really appreciate it. I do hope you found this helpful. One question came in. I've been watching regulations.gov for the expected update on NAICS size changes. Do you know when it can be expected? I do not know off the top of my head, but I can certainly look into that. I know the firm is tracking that, so I should be able to get you something. Not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. Again, thank you all. I hope you enjoyed this and found it useful. And if you're a news junkie like me, I know you probably knew all this already, but it's interesting to see how this has affected government contractors and will continue to affect government contractors. So again, thanks and happy Tuesday. Talk to you all soon.